Spoilers and offensive content to come.
I am Carlos.
This is Dave.
This is Two Fat Guys Talk, episode 134. We're gonna experiment a little bit. We're gonna try a few podcasts where we just talk about one thing. So this episode's title is simply Two Fat Guys Talk Final Fantasy. Now, Dave, I know for a fact that your first Final Fantasy game was the first one on NES.
Yep.
And I kind of want to know from you, was that your first turn-based RPG? How did you look at video games after it, or before it for that matter? How did it shape your perception of games, or what kind of genres you enjoy? Because I'm fascinated in learning what someone who got into the series much earlier than I did thinks of it.
Final Fantasy was not actually my first RPG.
Now, that I know, but I meant more your first Final Fantasy game. If I said otherwise, I meant to say that.
Well, and I mean, I kind of have to bring that up because Final Fantasy itself, not being my first RPG, because I loved RPGs previous to Final Fantasy was just really the next graphical and storyline based RPG that I played in the sequence. Because, I mean, Dragon Warrior did come up before that, and I did play Dragon Warrior 1 before Final Fantasy 1. I'd seen Final Fantasy previous to playing Dragon Warrior 1, but I hadn't actually managed to play it myself. But I'd say my first RPG I played would have been Dragon Slayer on the Atari tape system.
One of the 8-bit computers?
No, that was like literally the Atari 2600 with the master controller, which plugged into a tape drive, and you played the game off of tape. And that sucker had 3 different sections to it. You'd load up the first section, play that for possibly hours upon hours, and then you'd get to the gatekeeper, either fight him or pay him off, and then it would say, load the next section. You'd play the tape, and you'd hope that the bars would fully build on the screen. It would be like a do, and if it fully loaded, you'd play this next section of the game. If it didn't fully load, you're probably fucked, and you had to start the first part over to play the second part of the game. And then the third part would be the even bigger challenge.
So Final Fantasy was nice for you then, because you didn't have to worry about tape. You had the reliability and the never-failing nature of a ROM cartridge.
Well, I'd say my second go at a RPG would have been the Ultima series on Commodore 64. Except I did not understand a single effing thing that was going on in that game, so I would get thwomped so freaking fast, and I tried multiple times over the years to figure out what was going on, but with no instruction manual, I didn't have a chance.
I played a game recently where the game heavily encourages you to figure out the entirety of its puzzles by itself, called Tunic.
Yep.
I played it, streaming it with friends, and I recently got the true ending of that game. Drew so many diagrams, actual diagrams on paper,
yep,
to solve this game without looking anything up. It's quite a neat feeling you don't get in games too often. You have to actually, work a little bit to solve some of these RPGs back in the day.
That is a little bit rare these days, absolutely. But on to Final Fantasy itself. So yeah, Final Fantasy 1 being my first NES Final Fantasy game. I mean, you don't even actually get the Final Fantasy scroll until you're an hour or two into the game, after, you've gone to save the princess and they fix the bridge so you can move on, and then you get the whole scroll of what the game actually is about.
Yeah, you get the cold open with the original Final Fantasy theme that they still use to this day. Oh
yeah, and, I mean, the first time you hear that, it's just like, it's glorious. I mean, you don't have a clue what you're in for yet.
What I found really interesting about the first Final Fantasy is that Because one of my turn-based RPGs, one of my first ones, was Wizardry,
Yes.
which I think I played on an Apple IIe.
Oh boy.
It was either that or some Tandy system.
Mm-hmm.
And Wizardry is a funny series because it started in the West, but then it eventually migrated over to Japan, to the point where when you get a new Wizardry game, it comes from Japanese publishers.
Yep.
And they always took to it, but there was a lot of cultural kind of bleeding over even back then, because Final Fantasy had a lot of D&D elements. When I played a remake of it later, I got a proper MP system, but if you go play the original or the new Pixel remaster, you realize it uses the spell slot system from D&D.
Yep.
I've read recent D&D source books, and I realized, oh wow, this is just the spell slot system from the first Final Fantasy game. I think 2 and 3 used a similar system.
It did.
So it's interesting how much Western influence pervaded some of these early RPGs, but then they eventually became their own thing and very Japanese and very anime.
Yeah, it was a challenging game. I still remember getting to certain parts of that game, and if you didn't plan out, the resources you had, the magic you had, how you decided to buy the weapons for different characters and armor, what classes your party was made up of, really changed how your journey went. Like, if you chose to have a fighter, a thief, a red mage, and a white mage, you were in for a lot of hurt throughout that game. But, whenever I went through that game, I had 2 fighters, a white mage, and a black mage. Because that was ultimately the easiest you were going to get in that game. You were covered for getting, the level 8, or was it level 6?
I think the magic went up to level 8 in that.
So you could have level 8 white, and you could have level 8 black magic, whereas if you had a red mage, you couldn't get the 7th or 8th level.
It was either that or you just couldn't get the best spells.
Yeah. Including Exit, which you needed for near the end of the game. Well, you didn't need it, but it was a one-way ticket if you didn't have it.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember how frustrated I would get because, of course, you could name your characters when you chose them.
Yeah.
And, I'd always try and name the fighter that would generally become the stronger of the 2. But that sucker was random. It wasn't that the first fighter you made was the stronger of the 2. Because it was random just how much up their stats went on level up. Either character would become stronger than the other kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So that was always frustrating. It's like, well, okay, I got Dave, I got, somebody else, Carlos. Carlos is always the black mage.
Yeah. See, that's another holdover from Dungeons and Dragons, is rolling for your level ups.
Yes.
And them not always being consistent, as we would see in much later JRPGs.
Yes. Like, later on, you knew what your stats were supposed to be at certain levels. There was 0 randomness, but that game still had randomness to it. And I remember the cockatrice, the sorcerers, those instant kill mofos that you'd run into. The only real guy that we have that in later Final Fantasies is the Tonberry.
Where you run into them, and if you don't know the lore behind this creature and you try to fight it, you get knifed.
Yes. Yes, exactly. The dungeons in Final Fantasy 1 in the original version, those were not easy, but by today's standards, they weren't exactly hard either. They gave you the map of the dungeons, including where the chests were. And that the giant table of all the weapons and their stats and everything else.
They gave you this in the box, right?
Yes,
so
they did.
So if you rented this from your local Blockbuster video,
you probably didn't have
you didn't get no map.
Final Fantasy was an eye-opener. Like, very quickly, you went from walking to having a boat. And that was just new in RPGs for me, because it was like, what do you mean I got a boat? You mean I can actually go on the water? Holy crap.
What the fuck am I supposed to do with this boat?
And then when you actually unlock the airship in that game, and you know all of a sudden you have the view of high up, it's like, okay, this is bloody sweet. And of course, when your characters got the rat's tail and became the upgraded version of your characters, you know, all of a sudden you're not the fighter, you're the warrior.
Or you become a paladin, I believe. And
No, that paladin was the that was the PSP upgrade to that. You went
the original game, the Warrior of Light, did become like they either called it paladin or knight, because you got white magic even in the original.
It was knight.
Yeah, because in Japan I guess they conflate knight and paladin quite a bit,
and that's fine. That's fine.
The thief became the ninja.
Yeah,
got black magic.
Mm-hmm.
The monk, the master, and each mage became their respective wizard.
Yes, and I mean that was neat too, because I mean you went through that dungeon to actually get the rat's tail was where you ran to the sorcerers for the first time, and I mean you cringed whenever a random battle came up. I mean, back then you had random battles. It could be 2 steps, it could be 1 step, it could be 10. You could never really figure out where those balances were. I mean, people have figured it out now. But back then it was, come on, don't get into another battle, please.
Well, I played through RPGs, including Final Fantasy games, where I dread a random battle in a place. Like the first time going through Final Fantasy IV, in the last dungeon, because I was underleveled, I had rented the game.
Mm-hmm.
And every random battle is against a boss with a boss theme that has its own kind of weird scripting, and I tried to avoid and run from as many of those as I could, except the ones that you couldn't run from.
Yeah, and it's funny. My first time through Final Fantasy 1 was actually twice through the game, because I didn't know to go back in time. You had to use the crystal. Couldn't figure it out. Of course, there was no BBSs or internet at the time to give me a hand. So I thought I'd missed something or the game had glitched. I went through it a whole second time.
That's funny. The funny things we miss. The little tiny things. Some things permanently missable in these games, where you miss something and you're not getting it back unless you do another new game. So
well, and that was just it. There was no such thing as a new game plus or anything else. I mean, you only had 1 battery slot.
Yeah, and assuming you're still playing this now, you have replaced that battery by then.
Well, in today's day and age, yeah.
Or replaced it with some kind of non-volatile memory.
Yes. Now, playing Final Fantasy 1 on the PSP years later, I mean, that was easy mode. No, number one, the graphical updates were very much appreciated, especially in the sprite work and some of the FMVs they added and everything else. But going to an MP system was just like, oh man, I can completely... And you had ethers because you had MP now. So it's like, I don't ever have to go back to town, for fuck's sake. It was so easy in comparison to the old days. To the point that I'm surprised they didn't make both versions for the new Pixel version. Let you choose.
Yeah, the Pixel remaster, they were real anal about being more like the original in certain ways, so there's no extra super dungeons that some of the other versions had.
Which is stupid.
Now, your first Final Fantasy was the first one. My first Final Fantasy, believe it or not, was Final Fantasy VI.
Good
on
place
Super
to be.
Nintendo. Now, I hadn't played too many turn-based RPGs before Final Fantasy VI. I always was, and I still am, more of an action game guy over turn-based stuff. So the only time I'd played some turn-based games were like some wizardry games on computer. In fact, I played Square Enix games before, or Square rather, games before Final Fantasy, and that was Secret of Mana, which was also an action RPG.
Yep.
In fact, that was my first introduction to the Moogles. I was surprised to see Moogles in FF6. Not only that, I was surprised they kicked ass.
Yes.
Whereas in Secret of Mana, they're super docile, and there was even a status effect. You could get turned into one and you couldn't attack. Now, this really shaped my kind of perception of gaming, because Final Fantasy VI not only introduced me to turn-based games, turn-based RPGs, which I would then go seek out Final Fantasy IV, Lufia and Lufia 2, stuff like Breath of Fire and Breath of Fire 2,
Chrono
even
Trigger.
later systems like Wild Arms, one of my personal favorites, Chrono Trigger.
Yes.
Lamenting some of the ones that didn't get released here, like Alive, which is getting an HD 2D version here soon. But Final Fantasy VI not only opened that door, it opened my door to video games having more grown-up issues. And this was even before Mortal Kombat 2, when the Nintendo decided, fuck it, we like money. This was still the era where Nintendo censorship in America was still in play, and when Ted Woolsey over at Square was translating everything and hella overworked.
Yeah.
So despite that, we still got a lot of interesting themes in Final Fantasy VI I never really saw in video game stories. Themes of abuse, of pain and loss, of inferiority complexes compared to your advocates and siblings. In terms of feelings of suicide, teen pregnancy, how to deal with stress in the apocalypse, how to deal with the loss of family, how different people grieve. And those are ideas in that game that still shape my perception of the world around me today. Sometimes I think about things I see in terms of something I saw back in Final Fantasy VI. I still play that game in all its different versions fairly regularly and discover new things I didn't know before. So Final Fantasy VI was my first one, and really what opened up the door for me actually enjoying the Final Fantasy series. And I do mention the genres that I enjoy. Like, I'm still action game guy. I'm definitely happy that Final Fantasy 16 kind of looks like a character action game with RPG elements. But this brings up the topic of how Final Fantasy has not always been one genre. They certainly started as turn-based RPGs, but there have been spin-offs and even games in the mainline series which have definitely experimented with what genre they fall under and what constitutes their gameplay loop. So I guess let me ask you this. What Final Fantasies that have broken the mold have you enjoyed and why? In terms of the mold being the turn-based RPG mold.
Well, okay. I mean, I made a kind of a list of what games... You have a section that you'd mentioned about favorite moments / stories in the games.
Okay, we can talk about that instead, other than my question.
No. Your question is valid. It mixes in with that, so you're going to hear a couple things twice.
Okay.
So, let's look at where I thought Final Fantasy started going off the rails, and I didn't like them.
Mm-hmm.
Final Fantasy 12.
12 is one of those ones where... Final Fantasy has sometimes been more about the story than the mechanics, where the mechanics are super easy because they just want to tell a story, like FF7. And sometimes they ignore the story completely and just want to be very mechanically in depth, like 12. Now, I'm not saying, that's not me saying I liked the mechanics of 12. I did not. But it's an interesting entry in the series regardless because of that.
I mean... There was very little I liked about 12. From its main character to its trying to bring in auto mechanics, but we're not going to give you access to all of the mechanics because fuck you.
I like the Gambit system. I would have liked it a lot more if I had all the options available to me at the beginning.
Well, and that's just it. They wanted to limit you until near the end and build up the options that you could do, or you could still kind of play manually, but you were almost gimped a little bit if you tried to do the manual options. Like, they really intended you to focus on those automatic options, and it really telled.
You can do the Knights of the Old Republic thing, where you pause, you issue commands, you unpause, and you pause when you're comfortable again. You can do that. The only problem with doing that, and I had the same problem in Knights of the Old Republic and Baldur's Gate as well, is that doing it that way blows because it's boring.
And that, I didn't mind it so much in Knights of the Old Republic, funny enough, but the other two, I had that exact problem. So 12 was definitely an experiment gone wrong in many, many ways. And unfortunately kind of showed how Square's thinking of mechanics and storyline kind of started to, at least in my opinion, suck.
My understanding of 12 is that the main characters of that game were supposed to be Bosch and Ash, which makes a lot more sense. Vaughn was kind of added because they felt they had to appeal to a demographic. And
it was boring.
There's certainly a case to make about how Japanese storytellers appealing to really garbage otaku demographics. I'm not going to get into it in this episode, but Vaughn is definitely a case in point there.
Vaughn and his girlfriend were...
Penelo!
Congratulations for remembering the epitome of boring. But those two were ultimately what killed the game for me. I couldn't care.
But then you had cool character. Every other character was interesting, though. Because you had Bosch, you had Ash, you had Balthier, the MVP of that game, and by far manliest, most suave, Han Solo-esque Final Fantasy character Chad that ever existed.
But I still had to deal with boring characters being the front line, so I quit. 12 is actually one of only 3 Final Fantasies that I have never finished.
Other than the MMOs.
And that would be 12, 13, and 13-3.
Oh, and we should also say, and other than the side stories and spin-offs and stuff.
Then there's 13. Now, 13, to this day, I will still defend its battle system. I actually like the idea of switching between classes on the fly and, breaking the enemy's armor, then being able to go after their life directly kind of thing. I thought that was a neat battle mechanic and kept me playing that game way longer than that game had any right to have my time. Because that game's story and characters were garbage, even more than 12. And watching Spoonie's playthroughs of that game just bring back all the hate. As we're going through those games, though, we're seeing 12 was going to they wanted to go to a much more action-oriented system with their whole automation stuff. 13 played a little bit more turn active bar style, but because you were switching back and forth within all the different classes on the fly, it felt more actiony, but it still wasn't full action until you hit 15.
Yeah, that's the thing. I would argue 12 was trying to be an offline MMO in terms of its combat system. It felt more like FF11 or even WoW, slower and offline.
Yeah.
While 13 felt more like the old turn-based system, but simplified in some ways and made flashy and over the top for better and for worse.
Yes. And then 15 was just completely... Well, no, it wasn't completely action-based because you could still pause. You could still do your summons and magic and items. So in that way, it was more of going back to a style like Baldur's Gate and those. But, I mean, you were running across the field. You were hacking and slashing. You didn't have to pause ever if you didn't want to.
There's still a real-time component to it, and Final Fantasy VII Remake did the same thing, where, you could pause to issue commands, but you couldn't pause and do your attack string. You had to do that, and your movement manually still.
So, 15 was really simply a variation off of the Kingdom Hearts kind of combat system.
It started life as Versus 13, which the game looked like what a lot of the Kingdom Hearts 4 material we saw recently look like.
Yes.
Until they brought it down to earth a little bit and made it FF15.
And, taking Final Fantasy 15's engine and turning into what they did for Final Fantasy VII Remake just made it all the much better.
I mean, I like when Final Fantasy games go down the action route. I think that was a good move for FF7 Remake. I'd be over the moon if Final Fantasy VI got something similar. I'd just be ecstatic about it. And as mentioned, Final Fantasy 16 looks like it's going... It's almost going to be like a Nier Automata bit, where it's like a character action game with RPG elements in it, right?
Well, and there's that other one coming out from Square Enix that looks very similar in that regard.
I don't recall. Babylon's Fall, maybe?
No, not Babylon's Fall. Stars a black teenager taken from the real world into the fantasy world, and she's doing the whole magic fighting.
I don't remember the name of that. I'm looking forward to that. That is being done by a Western studio and published by Square, as far as I know, though. So it's not really Final Fantasy tangential, but it seems a little bit inspired at the very least.
Yeah.
And we can talk about games inspired by or that came from Final Fantasy.
Well, I mean, Nier Automata feels very much like a action-oriented Square game.
Oh, for sure. But not just Square games in general. I mean games that were going to be Final Fantasy games, but then for some reason or another, not. For example, Secret of Mana. Secret of Mana was supposed to be some kind of Final Fantasy action game for the Super Nintendo CD.
Right.
And when that peripheral shit the bed, they ended up cutting like 50 to 60% of the content in that game, which was supposed to have time travel, and gutting the story, and kind of making it a Seiken Densetsu title. Chrono Trigger was supposed to be Final Fantasy VII, and in fact used a lot of the time travel elements that Secret of Mana dropped, and some of the character designs. If you ever wondered why Chrono looks a little bit like Randy, and why Mara looks a little bit like Prim, yeah, that's because they used to be the same character.
Okay.
In fact, now that I think about it, Cloud has a similar spiky hairstyle, and may in fact have been some iteration of Chrono at some point too. Chrono Trigger was originally going to be Final Fantasy VII. It had ideas from a whole bunch of writers at Square, and originally it was going to be a time travel story where you see it from the perspective of a time-traveling detective. It eventually turned into its own game, Chrono Trigger, while Final Fantasy VII became its own idea, although it had some elements of that, like the kind of the cyberpunk universe. There was no time travel involved. So there are definitely at least two series that have to do exactly that owe themselves a little bit to Final Fantasy. Chrono Trigger even had the active time battle system.
Yeah.
Another series that has that is the Saga series. Now, Final Fantasy II on the NES, not my favorite game. I was not a fan of it, but it did some interesting things. The game's director, Kawazu, who runs the Saga games now, did things in that game like no levels. You leveled up the stats you used. And a little bit of more open world architecture to it, not unlike an Ultima game.
Yeah.
And that kind of became the baseline for how the Saga games work. And Saga Frontier is maybe my favorite iteration of that series. So another one, we owe it directly to ideas that started in Final Fantasy. It's fascinating to see how much influence this series has had.
Especially seeing as, Final Fantasy 1 was supposed to be literally his Final Fantasy.
It was supposed to be Square's last game, because they were on financial hard times. It ended up saving the company, and they're still alive.
Yep. And I mean, for me, Final Fantasy 1 was the first game that was, actually took longer than a couple hours to finish kind of thing. It was a long, 40-hour plus game, especially if you tried to level yourself up to 50. Because to get to level 50, you had to make multiple jumps into back in time.
Yeah, and then you'd always exit that dungeon.
Yep.
Which, that's why you needed the exit spell, because otherwise, back in time to go beat Garland /Chaos/Jack, that's a spoiler, is definitely a one-way trip.
Yeah, I mean, the Black Mage had warp, but for that one, you had to be on that first floor of back in time, because you can only warp back one floor, or exit, which would take you from any floor out of back in time. I remember that mechanic not being quite front and center until you worked out for yourself, because all you had was the actual spell descriptions. You didn't exactly explain the situations that would would get it. Even the fact that Warp only did one floor versus Exit being out was different when you were dealing with Back in Time. So that was interesting. The Mass Immune being Back in Time there.
The Masamune,
And if you were smart, you always gave it to your white mage. Your white mage became awesome.
Why don't we go through each in the mainline series and maybe some of the spin-offs? Let's say who our favorite character in that game is and what our favorite moment is in it. How about we do that?
Sure.
Let's start with the first game. Now, my experience with it is a lot more limited and generally relegated to the remakes, though I have played the NES original. I think my favorite character from that game is a character that would get iterated on a lot later, but I just love the concept of the Red Mage, of the suave everyman, what in D&D would be considered the bard, the character who could melee a bit, who could magic a bit, who could do both types of magic, which is something that the other two mages couldn't do, but they never were, like, they were the jack of all trades, master of none, but they were stylish as shit while they did it. And favorite moment, I guess the idea of going back in time and there being a time loop at all. Kind of interesting how the first Ultima had a plot twist about you going into space, and the first Final Fantasy had a plot twist about time loops. Just kind of interesting how ambitious these first games were.
For me, Final Fantasy I's ultimate moment would have been when you class upped, getting through the castle, getting the rat's tail, and then bringing that back to the Dragon Lord. And he's just like, okay, I will. It was almost like your characters were growing up. And that moment when you realize, okay, your guys had now become your adult versions of those characters. Okay, you looked badass. All the characters looked awesome. It was like, okay, it's time to kick the shit out of some stuff. That would be my ultimate of that. I liked the idea of Chaos. Chaos was just neat as much as I hated him. Both for, the character within the lore, as well as the fact that he could kick your ass unless you were lucky or smart in how you fought him. So, yeah, that was Final Fantasy 1 for me.
Let's move on to 2 then.
Now, we're talking
NES 2.
I have very limited knowledge of 2 and 3J, simply because we didn't have access to it for a long time, and the translations were not great in the fan translations for a long time.
I have very little experience with 3. I have more experience with 2, because I wanted to play kind of the origin of the Saga games, although I'm still not a fan of 2. I go through to completion.
Mm-hmm.
I liked Furion, mostly because in Dissidia, he seems to be like a weapon master who carries every weapon on him.
Okay.
But it's more his Dissidia take. And favorite moment is when I read in an interview when the original programmer of that game made Ultima shitty, because Ultima comes from that game.
Yep.
And it was supposed to be the ultimate spell, but when you obtain it, it sucks. And it turns out the programmer did that on purpose, because sometimes you work hard for something and it's disappointing. And Kawazu demanded he change it, but the programmer said no, and he encrypted the data so they couldn't change it.
Wow.
That's my favorite story from 2.
Okay. I'll go with that. I have no take on 2, unfortunately.
3, I don't really have a lot of experience for 3, but 4 I have a lot of, because after I was so smitten with Final Fantasy 6, then 3, I started seeking out other ones, and one I played a lot of was 4. 4 had a lot of interesting redemption stories with Cecil, with Kain, with Golbez even.
Yep.
And I think Golbez, he had kind of the crappiest redemption story because he was being mind controlled. But I kind of always, I always liked Kain. I know he was a douche, but I mean, I kind of like the characters who are big royal screw-ups, but they come around and do the right thing anyway because they know they're big royal screw-ups. Kain was the original Catra.
Yeah.
Really. And the best story in that game, the best moment I can think of is when the evil party, the Golbez, has taken control of the Giant of Babel, and they're marching on and blowing up the world, but then all the united armies come to stop it, and that triumphant music starts playing, and you realize that you've actually touched the lives of everyone in the world, and they put aside all their differences to stop this long enough for you to get inside and shut it down. That's my favorite moment from 4.
Okay. I have 2 favorite moments from 4. When you overcome being the Dark Knight and become the Paladin, both the music and the way they did it, where you're seeing your mirror image and defeating them, defeating yourself. I love that moment where you become the Paladin. Second favorite moment would be when you get the second airship, and it's just like, what, you think I only have one? What sort of... Sid is awesome.
No, Sid is great
and
in the game.
Just Sid's attitude, the fact that, he had the second airship, he just how he treats you in that moment. It's like, what, you think I only have one? Get your ass downstairs and get the fucking airship, you adult. Yeah, and the music that just plays there where you bring up the second airship, it's just like, okay, we now have hope again, is just epic. Your moment, though, is also another fantastic moment. It's a Lord of the Rings style moment where everybody's just there, kind of thing. It's so good.
It's a good moment. Final Fantasy V, my favorite moment of that game is when I realized that this sucks and I just turned it off and I never opened Final Fantasy V again. And I think my favorite character is the fact that I turned it off and I never had to play it again.
I have a different experience with 5. I've never played that game to finish, mainly because I was part of a group that tried to help translate that fucker. And the group fell apart when we realized just how bad this game was. So my favorite character of that game is the meteor that tries to destroy the planet. I will admit, I kind of liked how the class/job system worked in the game.
That's something that definitely got a ton of refinement in Final Fantasy Tactics.
Yes.
But that was arguably the genesis of it.
Yes. But 5's main story and everything else, I could care less about.
It was just, I didn't care for the look of it. I didn't care for the music in it. I didn't care for the characters. And at the end, I was just like, man, sorry, I missed nothing.
Exactly.
6 is my favorite one in the series. Also my first one. Still one of maybe my favorite game period in all of gaming. My favorite character is Terra. I love her story. I love how confused she is throughout. I adore that woman. If there's ever a sequel, I want her to be the main character of it. And my favorite moment in the game is similar to what you said about 4. And ironically, a moment Terra's not around for. It's when they realize they need an airship and they're lucky Setzer has a second one. They find it in storage and they don't know if it's even going to work. And they're like, no, come on, it has to work. And then as they burst through that underwater hangar and it comes through the water, it starts playing the song Looking for Friends. And it's that emotional, hopeful theme. I actually get teary when I hear that. That is my absolute favorite moment in the game. A close second being when the entire party faces down Kefka at the end, and he's laughing them off, and he's trying to tell them you don't know what love is, and that's why you're going to lose.
Yeah, all good moments. I am partial to the opera scene myself.
Fully voiced in the Pixel remaster.
Cool. That scene really just it does it for me for that game, because I definitely had more of an attachment to other characters than you in that game.
Yeah, you're more of a Celeste guy.
I am. I very much liked the romance that was going on with her. To that, and the opera scene just really summed up her character as a whole.
You mean Celeste's, right?
But Celeste's, yeah. Yes. So that's more than... Yeah, that is going to be my favorite scene of that. Followed by the fact that game actually had the balls to have you fail saving the world.
Mm-hmm.
When that moment happened, you just don't believe what you're seeing. It's like, no, how... I mean, it felt like if you'd won there, it would have been a very short game, granted. But you rarely have a chance to actually fail at these games and then have an actual ability to search a ruined world. At least back then.
The game was supposed to end with you stopping Kefka at the floating continent with more content in the World of Light, but they decided, development's going well. Let's add a whole new map.
And it worked. Without doing that, that game would not have had anywhere near as much impact as it did.
6 is great. I love 6. For 7, my favorite character is Tifa. I like her remake design better, but Tifa always stood out to me as someone who kind of got the short end of the stick on so many things. Like, she suffered just as much as Cloud, but she's not in the spotlight, but she loves Cloud, but he doesn't really love her until the options are kind of thinned out. But she doesn't hate Aerith either. She loves Aerith too. Like, Tifa just kind of gets the shaft. I like Yuffie as well, but Yuffie pisses me off, but I love Yuffie regardless. Favorite moment of the game? A lot of people will talk about Aerith's death, but that wasn't the one for me. The one for me that had a lot more impact is when Cloud is trapped in his own mind and Tifa's helping him get out. And he realizes that, holy shit, I really was in Nibelheim. I was Ramirez, aka he was the side soldier. He was actually always there, and he did stab Sephiroth and throw him into the life stream. It turns out he didn't tell a lie, he just remembered he was the wrong person at the same event.
Mm-hmm. That is an amazing event in that game. It's a big one. I had more of an attachment to Aerith than you did, obviously. When they killed her in that game, I had to step away from my computer. Now, and I guess this is part of it, is I'd managed to avoid spoilers for a couple years on Final Fantasy VII because I didn't own a PlayStation. I played this in the PC.
Yeah, you played the IDOS PC version.
Yes. So I'd managed to avoid all those spoilers, so when she died, that was traumatic, because I'd actually leveled her up enough to get her
level 4 limit
her
break.
level 4 limit break.
Where it just breaks the game.
Yep. So
Great gospel.
Losing her and having access to the internet at the time, I mean, my first search was, how do I bring her back? And of course, that had all the bullshit of fake stuff about bringing her back and everything else, and I realized even then that, okay, I can't get her back. So, I mean, that was almost traumatic, because I liked her character. Funny enough, in Final Fantasy VII Original, the back and forth between Tifa and Aerith, I never got that they hated each other, but I definitely didn't get the idea that they liked each other. That was more of a
remake thing.
That was more of a remake thing, where if they kill Aerith again, I'm going to be very fucking pissed.
I'm two things. One, it's funny how sometimes we say Aerith and Aerith, because I had a copy of the game, the original game, that had Aerith, and I know people who had a later press that had Aerith.
Yeah.
And eventually the official name became Aerith, but
either way. And on PC, it was Aerith.
Was it?
Yes.
Because that was a later version.
That was Aerith.
That's funny. Now, I'm going to talk about Remake a little bit here, because we are on 7, Final Fantasy VII Remake. My favorite character remains Tifa in it, for similar reasons. But I'm going to just say this, Aerith in Remake is... in the original game, I think the reason Aerith's death didn't hit me too hard is because I didn't really care.
Yeah, I can understand
it was more what she meant to Cloud than her being her own person. But Remake fleshes out Aerith super hard. She's a real person. And she's much more than just a dainty flower girl. She feels like a real human.
Yeah.
And I also don't want to see her die in this new timeline. Although I get why people are not enamored by this new timeline. I like it, and I don't want to see Aerith die in it, damn it.
Now, favorite moments from the original Final Fantasy VII would be when you first see the Golden Saucer.
Yeah, it's a good moment.
As well as the events that you do in the Golden Saucer, the fact that it had mini games, the of how much actually happens in the Golden Saucer, and the fact that you can do the whole ride with multiple different characters, depending on your friendship level with them.
I had Yuffie.
See,
you could get Tifa, Aerith, Yuffie, or Barrett.
Yes, and that was surprising for Square Enix or was it Enix at the time, or was it just Square?
At the time, it was simply Squaresoft. And then they became Square EA with that partnership about EA translating the games, which gave us some really good translations at the time. And then Enix, which it turned out they were the more stable company, they bought Square.
Yeah. So it would have been the Golden Saucer. It would have been the Red 13 father scene.
Oh, where you first go to Cosmo Canyon?
And you find his dad there. He hadn't ran away and abandoned them, that he was there stone petrified due to holding the line. That was an emotional moment there.
Red 13's such a good character.
The last...
Underrated character, Red 13.
The last would have been a glitch on the PC version, which to this day still pisses me off.
Uh-huh.
Where when you first get to the observatory, and they're supposed to explain the live stream and everything else in an FMV, on the PC version, depending on what video card you had, that wouldn't trigger, and so you were stuck. Exactly. I actually, for that one, there was the PC store that I had bought the game from let me install it on their computer for free, get past that scene with their video card, and then take the save file home, and I was fine after that. That has always stuck in my mind as just one of those things that they really weren't able to fix.
Great moments in Final Fantasy history.
Not exactly a favorite moment, but it's just one of those funny ones.
Well, it's one you'll never forget.
Yeah.
A core memory, if we're going to go by inside-out terms.
Yeah, exactly. FF8.
I think FF8 is very underrated, even though it's not my favorite game. Friend of the show, Richie, loves FF8. I think we've talked about time compression when he's been a guest on the show in the past. Now, for me, my favorite character in that game, I don't really have one. I guess I'd say Squall, because I always wish Squall was in a better game. I thought it was kind of cool to group him with the Final Fantasy VII characters in Kingdom Hearts, because he fits in with them a little better than he does with other characters in 8. So I'm going to go with Squall, even if I think he could have been handled better. My absolute favorite moment in that game is a very metal moment where you realize monsters are coming from the Blood Moon, and you see the monsters bleeding from the Blood Moon onto the world. And I'm like, this is an album cover. This is an absolute album cover.
For me, and you'll have to forgive me here because I actually forget the character's name.
Which character was
Renoa's dad.
Renoa's dad?
Yeah.
Was Laguna Renoa's dad?
Yes.
I thought that was just implied.
No, that was...
Wasn't it implied that Laguna was Squall's dad? I'm pretty sure that was the implication.
No.
Regardless, Laguna is the character you're thinking of.
Yeah.
The guy with the machine gun, right? The guy who had the alternate battle theme.
The one who was, back in the past.
Yeah, he had the machine gun. He was the character that Squall mind synced with when you got a past vision.
Yes.
And he had the two buddies, the big guy and the other guy.
Yes.
Those guys, I do not remember their names.
I liked the bouncing back and forth between the past and the present, and that was the character I really related to back at that point. I mean, Squall and his group, they were okay. The world was actually interesting. The whole floating schools and everything else, that was an awesome concept.
The gardens.
The magic system was interesting in that game, but I'm glad that they didn't go back to that.
It's not a bad system, but yeah, I like the idea of leveling your Guardian Force. They were still way too overpowered. This was back in the era of summons were just too good.
Yeah. And the thing I remember most about that game, again, I played that game from PC, was that I had a expensive Rumble controller, and the game did not support Rumble.
Boo.
So for some of those summons and things like that the control was supposed to rumble when you were supposed to tap buttons and stuff like that, none of that worked.
Lame.
So I was always disappointed that I didn't have Rumble for FF8. But for me, the ultimate scene for that one was just how ambiguous the ending was.
It was definitely a surreal ending and a complete one to boot.
Yeah.
There was very little ambiguity in the end of it, but during it, you were kind of wondering, is Squall going to make it through this, right?
Yeah.
And he did find his way through with his connection to his friends. And it was nice to see, and it's nice to see how it connected all the way back to Idea in the past and the orphanage.
Yeah, so I mean, definitely an underrated Final Fantasy game, yet I'm glad with 9 they went back to their fantasy roots.
I would like to see a sequel to 8, I really would, but unlike with 6, I have no idea what a sequel would even look like.
Yeah.
Final Fantasy IX did go back to fantasy roots, but there were still, like, alien worlds, and there was a lot of angst in this game, probably more than 8.
Yes.
A lot of people forget this. Vivi's entire backstory is just tragedy, and he's gonna die very young. Vivi was probably... He was one of my favorite characters, but not my favorite. I'm a fan of Steiner. And the reason I'm a fan of Steiner is because he grows with the game. He starts the game being like, you rascally Zidane, I'm gonna get you.
Yeah.
And then as you go through the game, he grows. He realizes this is a bigger world. There's bigger problems. And I need to be a team player and actually help this kid. He knows he's actually here to help. Steiner starts the game as an ignorant buffoon, and he ends it as a seasoned warrior with a hot wife.
Yes.
And I love Steiner to death. And my favorite moment in that game is when you're near the end of the game and the end of Disc 3, and Zidane learns about his origins from the other world, and his mind is all fucked, and he's like wandering through town, and like he's wandering into like this monster, and all he can think of was, my life is meaningless, my life is pointless, and it's playing that triumphant music as all his allies try to reach him. And that is my absolute favorite moment in that whole game.
Okay. For me, my favorite character, again, you'll have to forgive me, I don't remember her name.
Okay.
The princess.
The princess's her nickname was Dagger, her real name was Garnet.
Yes, thank you. Garnet is my favorite character because of all the shit she goes through as well.
She goes through so much
She goes through so much horror and pain and
shit.
Having to realize, her mother was an awful human being, but she still cared for her. Even to the end, she still tried to save her, even though her mother was like, treated her like shit. It was like, no, I'm not going to let you save me.
I remember the girl from Speedgrapher, her mom was a piece of shit too.
Yes, reminded me very much.
But when she died, when her mom died, she still tried to like save her and beg her mom not to leave her.
There were a great deal of similarities between Garnet and that character in Speedgrapher. My favorite scene, though, is just how close the ending video matched the beginning video. Just Garnet's reaction to realizing he was alive there, and when he takes off the mask and she runs down, and like, I love how Steiner and the other knight block her. Beatrix blocks her at first, and then they're like, "Go ahead," showing how much they had both grown together. And, she runs down, she does the whole hugs him, and then she starts
beating on his chest. Like, you son of a bitch.
Like,
I thought you were dead.
and he just kind of shrugs and gives her the hug and everything else. I mean, that was a fantastic way to end that.
That was a great ending. Great ending.
I've got that video saved, ripped from my original copy on PC. Somewhere on my hard drive still. I can just watch it on YouTube, obviously now, in better quality. But it was that journey. You watch the beginning video, you watch the end video. I mean, you honestly thought, he could be dead, and here she is watching the troop again, and she's going to break down. Yeah,
rips the cloak off. It's him.
It's him.
He made it.
So fucking good.
After they defeated Necron, he helped out Kuja, and he came back.
And I mean, Vivi, yeah. I mean, you had to love that character. All the trauma he went through. I mean, by the end of that game, you didn't know whether he was going to live a short life or not. That was always left up to be very ambiguous. And I think that's a good way for them to have done that. 9 was a great advancement back to the old, more of a fantasy style, but as Squaresoft, Square Enix have proven over the years, even if they try and do a fantasy, quote-unquote, based story, I mean, you add some steampunk, you add some sci-fi alien stuff. You can't just have a fantasy-based Final Fantasy anymore. You've got to have those out there elements to make it a Final Fantasy. And yeah, I love 9 a lot. I wish that 9 would get an upgrade treatment.
Whatever happened to that French animated series we were supposed to get?
It's still coming.
Fantasy 9?
It's still coming.
I'm looking forward to this.
If it ever happens, ever actually comes out, I'm going to watch this. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, doing 9 as an animated series works.
Plus, the French are fucked up. They'll get the fucked up moments, like, down.
Yes. Yes, they absolutely will. And then we jump systems. We jump from the PlayStation to the PlayStation 2.
Yes.
And we have Final Fantasy X.
Now, I think we're going to say our favorite character from that game on 3, and it's going to be the same character. Are you ready? Okay, so I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, character. Okay? And then, so 1, 2, 3, and then we'll name the character. Okay, ready?
Hang on. Well,
it's going to be the same character. Don't worry. Okay, ready? Okay, I'm going to count. Dave's just pondering, seeing if he remembers which one 10 is.
No, I know 10, but right now, for some reason, the only name I'm remembering is Waka, and that's not the character.
No, that's not the character. Okay, you'll remember it when the 3
Titus.
hits. You'll remember it when the 3 hits. You'll remember what the 3 hits.
Sure.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, jacked.
Fuck you.
Titus's way cooler dad, who should have been the main character of the game, thought his son was a fucking wuss. And he's right. The manliest man. The man who you can smell from here and it smells good and like a man does. Jacked. Motherfucking jacked. Jacked shot setup. Jacked shot made. The blitzball player king. The chattiest of chads. Burliest of burlies.
I will admit, good character. However, the character I liked most in that game was Luca.
Cool. Now you're gonna go back and remember which game you're playing, because there is no Luca character in Final Fantasy X.
Waka's hot wife.
Yes. You're thinking of Lulu.
Shit.
Now, Lulu is great. I was going to mention Lulu if
Yep.
Jekt didn't exist. But Lulu is fantastic because she's such a sassy
She
bitch.
is.
Especially when you attack the wrong target. Like if Titus tries to attack a Waka target, he's like, don't do that. That's for Waka. Like,
Yeah.
best moment? I like the very beginning when Sin just attacks Zanarkand and they're playing that music and you're running for dear life trying to abandon ship on what you would later learn was just a dream.
Yeah. Being the first Final Fantasy for the PlayStation 2, I mean, that game looked amazing at the time. It was just like, it played well, it looked amazing.
The first one in a long time to go truly turn-based. There was no active time bar there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even at 10-2 had the active time bar.
I mean, the summons you had in that game, the story was actually quite well done. I mean, granted, today Titus's laugh is horror fuel, but thankfully he only did that a few times, kind of thing.
I do believe his romance with Yuna. I really do.
Oh, I bought that wholeheartedly. I mean, I bought his character even... I had no inkling that he was fake or he wasn't a quote-unquote real person until the end. I never got into that. I never even thought that. So when he does the whole disappearing act at the end, not having been quote-unquote real, I mean, that was sad to me. I didn't need Final Fantasy X2, though.
10-2. I will admit I didn't really play it. I played the demo of it. Thought the active time system into 10's battle system worked well. I liked that it was fan service central. I've watched Let's Plays of it, and I've seen Spoonie play it. I know Spoonie's not a fan, but Spoonie's not a fan of a lot of things.
Yeah.
So I don't feel it's fair for me to really condemn or praise this game too much. I'm not going to. I am going to say my favorite character in it is the outfits. And my favorite moment in it is maybe that Yuna concert in the desert, which I thought was fitting.
I haven't finished the game, as I mentioned earlier, but the dress cores were interesting.
The dress spheres.
The dress spheres. I just didn't really think the game needed to be there. I didn't really buy into the whole, the battle, the whole dance battles kind of idle stuff that was going on. I thought that was kind of actually stupid within the world. But they wanted a game to bring Tidus back.
I do like that with 10-2, they weren't afraid to experiment a little bit.
And
You know what Yuna would never do in a million years? Dress in short shorts and be an idol. And she did.
So that's all I have to really say about 10-2. I mean, they bring back Tidus through bullshittery.
Mm-hmm.
And yay, they're happy.
11. Now, I've talked about my disdain for FF11 and how it hates the player so many times. I'm not even going to do that. I'm actually just going to stick to the character and moments I like the most. The character I like the most in Final Fantasy XI was Shantoto. She's just too cute. She's an adorable little munchkin mage with an attitude. And my favorite moment in that game maybe is when I first spawned in Sandoria and I heard that amazing music. I really like Sandoria, even to this day, with all my bad memories of 11. Sandoria is still home to me, and I still hear that theme now and then.
The music could be very good in Final Fantasy XI. I like a lot of the maps. How things looked and everything else. I like the visual presentation of Final Fantasy XI. And I love the days that they would hold events that would put you into dungeons and allow you to go through them solo within the events. Because really that was the only time I ever saw the dungeons because I didn't group up back then. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty much it. I have a lot of hate for 11 and how it was a second job and things like that. But really, the music would have been the highlight of Final Fantasy XI.
Yeah, definite highlight.
12.
Okay, this one we're both going to get. 1, 2, 3, Balthier.
Yeah.
Easily.
Mm-hmm.
The suavest Chad motherfucker in Final Fantasy. Holy shit, Balthier.
Okay, second best character though.
Okay, let's do 1, 2, 3 on that. Okay?
I don't know her. I remember her name though.
Okay. I'll say it and you'll tell me if I'm right. Okay.
Sure.
1, 2, 3. You didn't go along with me.
No, but you're right. The bunny chick.
She was cool.
She was cool.
The Viera.
Yes.
Favorite moment?
Turning the game off.
Yeah, I remember when I looked at the license board and I said, "Oh, this shit again," because the Sphere Grid in 10 did not leave a positive impression with me. And then I remembered, oh yeah, right, this shit, and I read guides, and I'm like, I don't want to finish this game. I don't care.
See, I didn't so much mind the Sphere Grid, and even the grid in 12, I didn't care. It was there. I was going to use it as much as I could. And the upgrade version of that one for the limited edition / re-release of it got even stupider. But, I mean...
12, it just went crazy. I need a license to use a specific weapon that I might never use again?
Mm-hmm.
Fuck you!
I mean, ultimately, when I think of 12, I think of just how stupid... that one Diablo 2 or Diablo 2 like on PC is.
Path of Exile.
Path of Exile. That's what I think of.
For FF12, my big issue is that the story's not good enough to carry the mediocre mechanics, and the mechanics aren't good enough to carry the mediocre story.
Yeah.
So what am I even bothering for?
I'm gonna give that game one big thing. I did like how on each of the maps you could do the different events, and each map had a rare enemy in a place that you could fight.
Sure, there was potential.
There was potential. that's a positive I'll give that game.
While we're talking about evilest games, this one came out after 7 and before 8, but Final Fantasy Tactics.
Yes, we should talk about that.
I think my favorite character in that is Ramza. What a great character. What a perfect example of not every noble is evil, but every person who does fight the system to try to do the greater good will be forgotten and trampled under. What a real world relevant lesson that the villains will win and write history even when the heroes save humanity in the end.
Yeah.
So good, and Ramza was right in the middle of it. And my favorite moment in that game, I think, was in the end of Chapter 3, when Rafa is mourning Malik's dead body. His name is Merrick in the remakes now, but I like Malik. The Zodiac Stone starts glowing, and Ramza's afraid. He's like, be careful, that'll turn you into a demon. But what it does is it heals Malik. No strings attached. It just brings him back to life. And then him and Rafa join you. And it turns out that the stone's power is a little more complex than just make people monsters.
Yeah. I can't really say a favorite moment on Final Fantasy Tactics. I will admit, I've never finished it. I've watched people finish it. Tactics, I love the way that Tactics works. I mean, I love XCOM style games and everything else, but because of how the random battles, or I guess they weren't really random battles, were they?
There were random battles in the game, for sure.
Because
but the storyline battles, some of them had some RNG, but most of them were fixed.
Because the random battles went based off of Ramza's level, and if he was more powerful than the other characters, you would get schooled.
If you were a scrub, yes. If you were a big dick Chad video gamer like I am, you just lived with it.
Yeah. I just never got around to really finishing it because I always made Ramza way too powerful and just kept on getting my ass kicked. And didn't, at the time, know of which abilities to abuse to get your guys through all of it.
That is a game where you can easily abuse one mechanic or another to just annihilate it. At least there are several ways to break that game instead of just one.
Yeah. So, yeah, unfortunately I've never finished it, but I still enjoyed what I did play of it, and I've seen it finished multiple times, so I know the story, thankfully.
13, best character. We'll do the 1, 2, 3 thing, okay?
1, 2, 3. Fuck you.
Snow. I'm joking. Fuck that douche. The best character in FF13, I'm going to say is Vanille, because she has nice tits. And the best moment in that game was staring at Vanille and not playing the game. Because every time I've seen it being played or heard about it or tried a demo, I'm like, wow, I'm not on board with Toriyama's little view of the guy is horny for lightning. It shows. And I don't want to stroke his dick. I just don't. I don't imagine it's an attractive dick.
The battle system kept me going way longer than that game deserved.
Yeah, you had mentioned that earlier.
And I hated every fucking character. Especially Vanille. Great tits, but my god, her voice actor made me hate that character so very much.
Dave, you shouldn't be commenting on her tits. She is underage. If anybody's bothered by that, fuck you.
Yeah, I in my notes, I've got, fuck that game, decent combat.
13-2, best character, Ultros. Best moment when Ultros appears in the Coliseum.
13-2, I would argue, is actually a good game. They took a really stupid world and stupid characters and managed to get me to like a couple of them. The whole alternate reality or alternate versions of each area as you go through and fix things was actually neat. It kind of reminded me of how a modern sequel to Chrono Trigger could be done very easily and very good. But unfortunately, it was the quest to save Lightning. And while playing her sister and the one new character to try and fix the world as it should be was more interesting than the main game was, I stopped caring after a while.
Lightning Returns. Best character. I like the design of God in that game, Bunavels. He's kind of cool. Best moment. When your friend just showed me the game and I played a little bit of it and I'm like, oh, this is kind of neat. This combat system I think really works when it's just one character and you can real time move while menu based doing things, and realizing, oh, this might actually be kind of an interesting system for literally some other game that I might actually want to play it in.
Again, the fixation on Lightning. Lightning was never an interesting character.
She had a Mass Effect costume in that game, as I recall.
Yes. It didn't save her.
So what was your best moment in it?
The best moment was the fact that I didn't play the game.
Excellent. 14. Now, we're going to ignore pre-A Realm Reborn, because...
Oh, no, I want to bring that up a little bit.
Just a little bit, please. We're getting a little over time, and you have talked about how shitty it is already in the past.
For those in the know, it had soft mouseware support.
Mm-hmm.
And
soft mouseware support.
And just ran like crap. There, that's all I have to say.
Okay. Soft mouseware. Gotcha. My 14 is a game that I played a little bit into Heaven's Sword, and then I realized this is a fine game, but it's not for me. But I do occasionally follow things about it, especially since I have so many friends and family members who play it.
Yep.
So I do keep abreast of situations in it. I do like that they become a lot more solo-friendly, too.
Mm-hmm.
Best character in the game is not Minfilia, but she has a fantastic ass. And the best moment in that game, I think for me, is any time Hildebrand is on the screen. The only time I didn't actively skip cutscenes. I know everyone and their mother says FF14 has the greatest story since sliced bread. I don't see it. More power to you. And
I can respect that view. The almost hour-long ending to the original Final Fantasy XIV Realm Reborn story.
Skipped it.
Of course you did. That whole...
I was only there to fight.
That whole final dungeon, with its music and combat and everything else, was just awesome.
It's pretty good at finale.
I mean, 14 does... As much as you skip the story and everything else, I think the story is fantastic. In Heaven's War, it did such a good job of making me care about a bunch of the characters in that. My favorite character, however, is the secretary to the guild you're in, the little Taro.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I didn't give you a good favorite character, Alpha Node, because he's a beautiful boy.
He's okay, but yeah, I'll take the little Taro secretary from our guild.
You like her so much that you don't remember.
You know I'm awful with names, even for characters.
Especially in FF14s, and it's great names like Merle Wib.
Yeah. 15.
So I played demo 15 and I loved it, and I don't know why, I just never got around to playing the main game. I own it, but I haven't played it. I will say that of the demo, I liked everyone. Mm-hmm. I didn't really have a favorite character. I liked the bro force. I wish one or more of them were women, just to break up the kind of bro monotony. But I'm not as much of a woke skull these days that I am then, so I'm okay with bro force. My favorite moment in the demo was when fucking Rama destroyed Behemoth, doing thousands upon thousands of damage to it so that you could grab its horn, go to the nearest 7-Eleven, and sell it at the 7-Eleven for some money. I love that. You can go to a 7-Eleven, then you go off the beaten path and you're fighting Magitech soldiers and Imp Caves and Behemoth. And then you go back to the 7-Eleven when you want a Slurpee. I love that.
I have a very big love-hate relationship with 15. 15... Well, okay. One of the mechanics that you just mentioned there, the Magitech soldiers. I thought it was the coolest thing that you could be in the middle of a quest, and all of a sudden, a Magitech soldier would detect you. You wouldn't take them out fast enough, and all of a sudden they would rain soldiers on you. trying to take you out. Awesome mechanic. However, not only do they interrupt you multiple times on quests, but it happens way too often. If it was a, guarantee it was going to happen once within an hour, okay, fine. But within a 10-minute play period, you could literally get attacked 3 times. And that was really the problem with 15, is things happened too often, became too annoying, and did not value your time. And again, I'm awful with names, but I loved playing the Prince.
Noctis Lucius Calum.
My favorite moment was waking up after your 15-year sleep to basically what was the apocalypse happening, and everybody being so glad to see you, you having aged the 15 years, but knowing that you were basically on a suicide mission to save the world and die. Yeah, that whole last 10% of the game, it was an emotional roller coaster. Between the conversations with your party members, the fact that your fiance was already dead at that point, and that you knew you were basically going to die, was something.
Mm-hmm.
And how the DLC may have changed that around to not happen.
No, which DLC is apt to do.
I kind of wish Square would stop doing stuff like that, actually, but that's...
So,
and then, 16.
Okay, so my favorite character in 16 is Jimbolio Benvolio, the Jester Knight of Rambladstar. And my favorite moment is there's a scene where they're riding a chocobo, and then what happens is you jump off it and you start kind of belly surfing down some snow, while at the same time casting Firaga up in the sky at attackers. And then you do a backflip off the snow into a snow cavern, and then you just kind of slide into a cool pose, and you have double peace signs. Great moment.
I think 16 looks neat for what they're doing, but they haven't given us enough to really talk too much about it. It looks like it's going to look very impressive, but I'm hoping for combat like 15, but definitely upgraded from that. I don't really need a party. Just a single person would be fine. Give me a party if you've got to. Have them act like 15 did, but definitely give me a better world.
If they have a party like 15, I'd rather also do the remake thing where I can take control of the others.
Mm-hmm.
So your playstyle is either you can just pick a character and stick with it, or you can rapidly switch like I did.
Yes.
Devaniel, did you enjoy talking to your buddy Carlos about Final Fantasy?
I did.
Folks, did you enjoy hearing us talk to you about Final Fantasy? Leave us a comment on the YouTube version of this video. I would say leave us a comment on our website, but we're in the process of migrating websites at the moment, and at the moment our current blogger site is getting inundated with spam, so I actually turned off comments for now to kind of just mitigate that. So just head on over to our YouTube channel and leave us a comment there, or to our Twitter. twofatguystalk.com is the location where you can find us. And leave us voicemail. Let us know what you thought. Let us know if you want us to do more individual topics. We definitely have a few we can do. We can do Warcraft. We can do Metroid or Zelda. We can do Doom. We can do movie series like Star Wars. Definitely a lot of material there.
Yeah. Okay, everyone. Tune in next time.
Goodbye.